I looked at my children, their small heads bent over crayons and notebooks, the soft weight of their trust resting on my presence. They did not know, could not understand yet, the storm that had arrived. And that realization, the sacredness of their innocence, made the blood in my veins cool into something focused and unyielding. I folded the letter slowly, deliberately, and placed it in the top drawer of the kitchen cabinet. I did not speak. I did not cry. I did not panic. I walked into the living room where my daughter had begun stacking blocks. "Are you okay, Daddy?" she asked, sensing only that my expression was tighter than usual. I knelt beside her, taking her small hands in mine, feeling their warmth. "I'm fine," I said, and it was the truth. More than fine. I was steady. I was aware. I was ready. Because in that moment, I realized that silence had its limits. The quiet acceptance I had cultivated, the calm patience I had practiced for years, had served me well. But now, it would not protect my children. Their well-being, their safety, their very home was being challenged by words that measured worth in dollars and appearances rather than love, presence, and responsibility. I had tried to live a life unseen, to let the world judge me by its superficial metrics while I focused on what truly mattered. And yet, now, the world demanded attention, demanded action, demanded that I reveal strength not in silence, but in demonstration. The fury that rose was measured, cold, calculated, not the heat of impulse, but the ice of inevitability. I felt it in the quiet of my chest, in the slow, deliberate tightening of my jaw, in the way my hands rested lightly on the table, yet ready to move, to act, to reclaim what was mine. I pictured my ex-wife's lawyers sitting in their polished offices, counting on my humility, counting on my decency, assuming that my life would be too quiet, too modest, too unremarkable to challenge them. They had no idea that what they saw as weakness was a reservoir of strength far beyond their imagining. I allowed myself a single thought, repeated quietly, like a mantra. They do not measure what matters. They never have. The children were still there, oblivious to the storm, their laughter and small voices threading through the apartment like threads of sunlight. That was what made my anger precise. It was not about ego. It was not about revenge. It was about protection, about reclamation, about setting boundaries so firm that no one, no paper, no courtroom, no outsider could ever breach them again. I began to plan, not in haste, not in fury, but in the deliberate way I had once built empires. Each step would be calculated, each move purposeful. Each moment would be used to reclaim control, not with noise, but with precision. I remembered the skills I had honed over a decade in business: timing, patience, strategy, observation. And I realized they were all applicable here. The same calm I had maintained while constructing companies, while negotiating contracts that spanned continents, would now serve a different purpose: the protection of my family. For hours I sat at the kitchen table, drinking my coffee now cold, running through possibilities, anticipating arguments, considering evidence, calculating outcomes. I did not pace. I did not shout. I did not break. The anger was a tool, not a fire. It sharpened my mind rather than consumed it. By late afternoon, my son approached, leaning against my shoulder. "Daddy," he said, small and hesitant, "will they take us away?" I closed my eyes for a brief moment, letting the weight of the question sink into my chest. And then I opened them, meeting his gaze with the calm certainty of a man who has seen storms before and knows how to navigate them. "No," I said quietly, evenly, "they will not." "But why are they saying that?" he asked. I smiled faintly, not the playful smile I usually reserved for them, but a firm, steady one. "Because sometimes people don't understand what's important," I said. "They think money and things are everything, but they're wrong. The only thing that matters is who shows up. And I will always show up for you." He nodded, apparently satisfied, and returned to his homework. My daughter leaned against my leg, small fingers gripping the fabric of my jeans. And in that moment, I felt it. Clarity. Anger had its purpose, but fear had none. The only response that mattered was action, measured, precise, unyielding. The children needed not an explosion of rage, but the calm force of a man who would not be moved. A man who would protect their home, their lives, their childhood without compromise. I picked up the phone, dialing my old contacts with a slow deliberation. Names I had not spoken to in years, people who had once been part of a world of wealth and power that I had deliberately left behind. I did not ask for favors. I did not beg. I stated facts quietly and firmly. My children's welfare was being threatened. I required support. That was all. No emotion, no apology, no explanations beyond the truth. By the time evening arrived, I had begun assembling the pieces, preparing for the confrontation that would come. Legal documents, proof of income, evidence of care, testimonies from neighbors, teachers, friends. Everything I had quietly accumulated over the years of presence, responsibility, and devotion. I realized with a calm that almost surprised me that this was the moment my life had been preparing for. The decade of quiet sacrifice, the years of choosing presence over prestige, the patience, the endurance, all had been necessary to give me the strength to face this challenge, not with noise, not with anger, but with cold, deliberate resolve. The children slept that night, unaware of the storm gathering beyond the apartment walls. I watched them for a long time, tracing the lines of their small faces in the dim light. And I promised myself, again, as I had promised years ago, in another life, in another apartment, in another world, that nothing, no one would take them from me. I felt the anger simmer in my chest, but it was not destructive. It was disciplined, focused, sharpened into a blade that cut through uncertainty, indecision, and fear. And I knew in that quiet moment that the time for patience had passed. The time for action had arrived. The ex-wife's lawyers could assume what they wanted. They could believe that a quiet life meant weakness, that modest means meant unworthiness. They could prepare their papers, their arguments, their attempts at intimidation. I would meet them with calm. I would meet them with certainty. I would meet them with the kind of quiet dominance that leaves no room for misjudgment or misunderstanding. Because this was no longer about me. This was about them, the children who had entrusted their lives to my care. And when your heart carries such responsibility, anger is no longer a fire to burn others. It is the ice that freezes uncertainty, the steel that secures safety, the calm that transforms threat into clarity. I slept little that night, not out of fear, but out of preparation. Every moment of quiet reflection sharpened my resolve, focused my mind, and reinforced the understanding that the empire I had left behind had never truly left me. It had only been waiting for the moment it was needed again, not for wealth, not for power, but for justice, protection, and the preservation of what truly matters. And when dawn arrived, gray and patient, filtering light through the thin apartment curtains, I felt no hesitation, no doubt, only calm, cold determination. The storm had arrived, yes, but I would not cower. I would not flinch. I would not fail. The world could measure wealth and success however it pleased. But I knew the truth. A father's worth is measured not in money, not in prestige, not in the approval of others. It is measured in presence, in protection, in the unshakable commitment to those who depend on you. And in that truth, I found a strength that no letter, no courtroom, no whisper of judgment could ever diminish. The apartment was quiet again that evening, the kind of quiet that felt heavy, almost sacred. My children had fallen asleep hours ago, their small bodies curled beneath blankets that smelled faintly of soap and hope. I sat at the edge of the bed, the soft lamplight casting a warm glow over the worn carpet and the thin stack of legal papers I had been studying all day. The letter from the ex-wife's lawyer still lay on the table in the kitchen, its cold, formal authority challenging everything I had built in silence. I had read it again that morning, though its words no longer startled me. Now they served a purpose, a catalyst. It was time. I picked up my phone and studied it for a moment. My thumb hovered over a number I hadn't dialed in years. The memory of his voice, calm and commanding, came back instantly. Robert, my old partner, the one who had built half the companies alongside me before I walked away from the empire. Я повільно видихнув і натиснув кнопку виклику. Клацнув рядок, потім пауза, вдих. Девід. The single word carried decades of shared history, respect, disbelief. I imagined the way his eyes would narrow slightly, the way his hand might tighten around the receiver, ready to measure whether this was serious or a joke. It's time, I said quietly. Not with anger, not with excitement, but with deliberate calm. I need your help. A pause, longer than necessary, filled the space. And then a laugh, low, incredulous, and amused. You, David, after all this time, the ghost billionaire walking away from it all, you're calling me? Yes, I said simply. It's for my children. The words settled on him, heavier than I expected. His voice, which had once been all business, all calculation, became attentive, slightly cautious. For what? He asked. I need leverage, I said. I need resources. I need what I left behind to protect the only thing that matters. The line went quiet again. I imagined him running through possibilities, numbers, contacts, strategies, the same way I had once done. And then, all right, he said finally. Let's see if the ghost still remembers how to walk among the living. I smiled faintly, not out loud, not triumphantly, just the calm satisfaction of someone stepping back into a role they had never truly abandoned. I made 2 more calls that night. One to a lawyer I had once trusted to manage international assets, now long retired from the fast world of mergers, but still meticulous, still exacting. The other to a former personal assistant, someone who knew the inner workings of the empire better than anyone else alive. Each call carried the same effect: shock, doubt, recognition. And then, once the initial surprise passed, respect. The kind of respect reserved for a man who had walked away from everything and yet retained the capacity to return at will. "Are you serious?" the assistant asked. "After all this time?" "Tak," сказав я. Yeah. They were careful not to say it aloud, but I could feel it, the unspoken thought that had never left anyone who had worked with me. "We thought he was gone. We thought he had abandoned it all. We thought no one could ever match him again. But here he is." That realization, that quiet acknowledgement of my own past, filled me with something colder than anger: determination, precision, a sense that the game had changed, not because I needed it to, but because circumstances demanded it. I began to make preparations immediately. Not flashy, not public, not yet. The court would not see me coming, not until the moment I needed them to. I organized documents, reviewed contracts and holdings, and quietly confirmed the accessibility of funds and assets I had carefully maintained in secrecy over the years. Everything I had walked away from had been placed under careful watch, hidden in plain sight, insulated from interference. Now it would serve a single purpose: to protect my children and reclaim the authority I had relinquished only temporarily. I set up a schedule: work during the day, apartment and children in the evenings, and strategic calls at night. I became a phantom in my own life again, moving silently, calculating, preparing. My old contacts were exhilarated but cautious. They knew my reputation. They remembered the patience, the ruthlessness, and the clarity that had once made me untouchable. They also understood that I had never truly stopped existing in the world of influence. They had merely assumed I no longer wished to participate. "You're serious," Robert said during a late-night call. "You're going to do this quietly?" "They come first," I said. "Always." There was a pause, and I could imagine him nodding, understanding. That was the difference between a man who has accumulated wealth and a man who has accumulated life. The former measures impact in numbers and attention. The latter measures it in protection, in presence, in outcomes that endure beyond ego. I spent the following nights meticulously compiling evidence: receipts, photographs, testimonies from teachers, neighbors, friends, small, deliberate proof that the children's lives were stable, loving, and thriving under my care. Every detail mattered. Every small act of fatherhood was cataloged, framed, and prepared to speak louder than words could ever convey. The apartment became my command center. Legal documents stacked neatly on the dining table, coffee cups lined up within reach, computer screens glowing with spreadsheets and correspondence. A quiet hum of focused energy filled the small space. Outside, the city moved in its usual, indifferent rhythm. Inside, I was constructing a silent force that would leave no room for misjudgment, no loophole for doubt, no argument for injustice. At times late into the night, I would pause, listening to the children breathe in their sleep. The soft rise and fall of their chest reminded me why I could not fail. The stakes were no longer abstract. They were tangible, human, sacred. And as I moved through the preparation, I felt something return that I had not felt in years. The thrill of quiet strategy, of deliberate action, the kind of thrill that comes not from recklessness, but from certainty, from knowing your resources, your capabilities, and your limitations, and then executing with precision. By the end of the week, the network I had quietly reactivated was ready. Allies who had once marveled at my decisiveness now waited for my instructions, knowing that when I moved with an economy of motion that left no room for error. Every call I made, every document I prepared was part of a single, coherent plan. To walk into the courtroom not as a man diminished by circumstance, but as a presence that could not be ignored, questioned, or dismissed. I remained in complete secrecy. No one outside the circle knew. My children, blissfully unaware, continued their routines. I delivered breakfast, packed lunches, and tucked them into bed with the same gentle care as always. My calm, measured demeanor never faltered. The storm was preparing in the background, but I remained their anchor, their constant, their quiet reassurance. Even as I planned, I reflected on the irony. I had walked away from wealth and power years ago to live a quiet life. Yet here I was, preparing to wield that very power. Not for ambition, not for vanity, not for spectacle, but for love, for protection, for justice. The courthouse was quiet in a way that felt deliberate, as if the building itself knew the weight of what was about to unfold. Polished floors reflected the pale winter light that filtered through tall, dusty windows. The air smelled faintly of paper, waxed wood, and something antiseptic. A faint metallic edge that made the tension palpable. I walked slowly down the corridor, my steps measured, deliberate, each click of my shoes against the marble a quiet announcement of presence. Inside, the courtroom hummed with low murmurs. Journalists shuffled papers, court officers moved efficiently, and a few onlookers whispered guesses about the man who had arrived in a private jet that morning, escorted by black cars that gleamed like obsidian. Their whispers carried curiosity, skepticism, amusement. I ignored them. I had always ignored the noise of the world, letting it fade until only what mattered remained. My children sat quietly in the front row, their small hands folded in their laps. Their eyes, wide and alert, followed me as I approached the table. The weight of responsibility was palpable, but it was not heavy. I had carried it every day of their lives, and now I would simply demonstrate the reality of that care. The ex-wife's lawyers, dressed in tailored suits and the practiced armor of their profession, rose as I took my place. They smiled faintly at one another, certain that their victory was predetermined. They believed my silence, my modest demeanor, and the apparent poverty of my life meant weakness. They were wrong. I placed my hands on the table, feeling the smooth wood beneath my palms. I allowed my eyes to meet the judge's with a calm, steady confidence. I did not raise my voice. I did not fume. I did not react to the subtle smirks or the whispered comments behind me. I only allowed the truth and the authority of presence to guide my actions. "My name is David Marshall," I began, my voice low, measured, and deliberate. The court fell silent. "I am the father of the children before you. I am also the former owner and operator of multiple international enterprises, all of which I voluntarily walked away from 10 years ago to prioritize my family." A flicker of surprise crossed the faces of the ex-wife's attorneys. They had assumed a man in my position would have no leverage, no resources, no foundation. They had assumed, in their narrow vision, that poverty equated to incapacity. And now they began to realize that appearances, as always, were deceiving. "I understand that my life may appear modest now," I continued, keeping my tone calm, almost gentle. "I live simply, work simply, and prioritize presence over prestige. But that simplicity does not indicate unfitness. It indicates focus, dedication, and responsibility." I paused, letting the words sink in. There was no defensiveness, no need for theatrics. The quiet authority carried more weight than any shouting could. The lead attorney cleared his throat, attempting the first challenge. "Mr. Marshall, the court is aware of your previous success, but your current circumstances suggest that you may not be able to provide the lifestyle deemed appropriate for these children. Can you explain?" I held up a hand, not aggressively, but with the absolute calm of someone who knows the truth will speak for itself. "I can, and I will." I leaned forward slightly, pulling a folder from the edge of the table. I opened it with deliberate care, revealing documents, account statements, and proof of assets. Each page was pristine, each number meticulously calculated. "These documents," I said, sliding them toward the judge, "demonstrate the full extent of my assets. Assets I have deliberately maintained in secrecy, not for personal gain, but to protect my family. They include liquid holdings, international trusts, real estate, and investments, all sufficient to provide for the children beyond any standard measure of need." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The ex-wife's attorneys exchanged quick, uneasy glances. Their confident composure, carefully cultivated over months of legal preparation, began to crack. They had expected to confront a man struggling to make ends meet. Instead, they faced a quiet force whose patience had been measured, whose resources had been underestimated, and whose authority could not be questioned. I let the silence linger, letting the weight of reality settle in the room. There was no need for spectacle, no need for displays of emotion. The facts spoke for themselves. "And there is more," I continued, my tone calm, deliberate, almost reflective. "During our marriage, I was aware of certain decisions made, financial and otherwise, that were not in the best interests of our family. Decisions made behind my back, without consultation, without transparency. The details are documented here should the court wish to review them." I slid a second folder across the table. This one contained correspondences, bank statements, and other evidence of betrayal. Not accusations meant to inflame, but evidence meant to clarify. Each document revealed actions that contradicted claims of stewardship and responsibility, exposing mismanagement and misrepresentation. The judge adjusted her glasses, reviewing the folders with quiet efficiency. She did not look surprised, but her demeanor suggested careful consideration. The room felt taut, like a string pulled to its breaking point, but held firmly by invisible hands. I leaned back slightly, allowing my presence to dominate the room in the most subtle way possible. I did not raise my voice. I did not gesture wildly. I only existed, steady and calm, a presence that could not be ignored. The contrast between the quiet confidence of my demeanor and the anxious shifting of the ex-wife's attorneys was unmistakable. "Mr. Marshall," the lead attorney said, voice slightly tighter now, "you are presenting significant evidence, yes. But the children, what of their day-to-day needs, their schooling, their stability?" I smiled faintly, the kind of smile that carried the weight of years of quiet observation. "Judge," I said softly, "their daily lives have been nothing short of stable. I have provided for them in every measurable way: education, nutrition, emotional support, and guidance. Their well-being has been my focus, my daily labor, and my constant responsibility. Any notion that modest lifestyle equates to unfitness is a misunderstanding of what truly matters in parenting." I paused, letting the room absorb the meaning of my words. The silence was absolute. My children's eyes, wide and attentive, reflected a mixture of awe and trust. They had always known I would protect them. Now the world was beginning to understand it, too. "Furthermore," I continued, my voice calm but carrying an edge of quiet authority, "the resources I have maintained in secrecy are not a sign of concealment, but a deliberate measure of prudence. Everything I have prepared is for the long-term security of my children. I have not flaunted wealth. I have not used it to impress. I have used it to ensure stability should anyone ever attempt to undermine the life we have built together." There was a long pause. The attorneys whispered among themselves. Their confidence had faltered completely. They had assumed a man of modest appearance could be intimidated, but instead they faced someone whose calm clarity cut through pretense like steel through mist. I allowed myself one final statement, measured and precise. "I do not seek to belittle anyone, nor to punish. I seek only what any parent would: the right to protect, guide, and nurture the children entrusted to me. And I will do so, not with noise, not with anger, but with absolute responsibility and unwavering presence. That is what I bring. That is what matters, and it is enough." The room was still. The judge's eyes, sharp and discerning, met mine. No one could deny the authority in my voice. No one could challenge the quiet dominance of presence, preparation, and truth. The power shift had already occurred, long before any ruling was spoken. It existed in the subtle command of calm, in the undeniable evidence of resources, in the unwavering demonstration of a father's commitment. The ex-wife's attorneys sat in stunned silence. Their mouths moved, forming words that never reached sound. They had assumed advantage, and now they had nothing but their own shock. The courtroom, which had anticipated spectacle and confrontation, instead witnessed the quiet assertion of a man who had spent years preparing not for ego, but for responsibility. I closed the folders slowly, returning them to the table with deliberate care. My hands rested lightly on the surface, steady and calm. The courtroom had been informed. The truth was clear. The children were safe. The balance of power, once assumed in favor of intimidation and superficial judgments, had shifted irrevocably. I looked briefly at my children. They were watching, alert, and aware of something beyond their understanding. And in their eyes, I saw trust affirmed, security restored. In that moment, all the years of quiet sacrifice, all the patience, all the enduring focus on presence over prestige were vindicated. The judge nodded slightly, making notes. There was no applause, no celebration. None was necessary. The revelation had spoken for itself. The power shift had been completed, and the quiet authority of a father's presence had been affirmed in the most absolute way possible. And as I stood, gathering my folders, my children at my side, I understood the truth I had always known. Real power does not shout. Real authority does not demand attention. Real strength is quiet, measured, unwavering, and, when exercised at the right moment, absolute. I walked out of the courtroom that day, not with triumph in my voice, but with certainty in my heart. My children were safe, their lives were secure, and I had proven once again that presence, responsibility, and quiet authority carry a weight far greater than any outward show of wealth or status. The ex-wife's lawyers had underestimated me, the world had misjudged me, but the truth, my truth, was unassailable. And in that quiet, decisive moment, the revelation was complete. The first morning after the courtroom victory felt deceptively ordinary. The pale winter sunlight seeped through the thin curtains of the apartment, scattering across the chipped linoleum floor and the small table where my daughter's crayons still lay. My children slept a little later than usual, wrapped in the warmth of blankets that smelled faintly of home, the small sighs of their dreams drifting through the quiet room. I sat at the edge of the bed for a long time, staring at the pale light filtering through the window. My hands rested lightly on my knees, and for the first time in months I felt the kind of calm that was deeper than anything I had known since the divorce began. The courtroom battle was over. The ex-wife, her lawyers, the whispers of judgment, all of it had receded, replaced by something far more enduring. Certainty. Certainty that my children were safe. Certainty that the life I had quietly built for them would continue uninterrupted. Certainty that presence, patience, and responsibility had won over the world's superficial definitions of success. I rose slowly and moved to the kitchen, where the small apartment already carried the comforting scent of brewed coffee. The heater had done its best, but the corners of the rooms remained slightly cold, a reminder of the life we had chosen. I poured a cup, letting the steam curl around my fingers. The warmth was subtle but real, grounding me in the tangible, the everyday, the ordinary moments that carried the weight of eternity in their quiet repetition. The children appeared soon after, rubbing eyes and yawning, their hair tousled in ways that always seemed perfect despite the chaos of sleep. My son walked into the kitchen first, placing a small hand on my arm. "Daddy," he said softly, "we're going to be okay, right?" I looked down at him, seeing the worry still lingering in his wide eyes despite the victory we had won. I knelt and brushed his hair back gently. Yes, I said. We're going to be okay. We always have been. He nodded, apparently satisfied, and returned to his breakfast, a simple bowl of cereal with fruit. My daughter, always curious and observant, poured herself a cup of warm milk and joined him at the table. Their chatter was soft and bright, the sound of normalcy reclaiming its place in our lives. I took a seat across from them, sipping the coffee I had made. It was bitter but honest, like the life we had chosen. The apartment was small, the furnishings modest, the walls bare in places where we could not yet afford decoration. And yet, in that small space, with the smell of breakfast and coffee mingling in the air, there was peace, there was stability, there was love. I reflected on the days of struggle, the humiliation I had endured, the subtle judgments of those who measured worth by income and appearance. None of it mattered anymore. It had been a test, yes, but not of wealth or status. The test had been whether I could remain present, steady, and unwavering for the children who depended entirely on me. And in that test, we had succeeded. The phone on the kitchen counter buzzed faintly with messages from my old associates, quietly confirming that the arrangements we had made were secure. No fanfare, no public announcement. Only the silent satisfaction that the children's future was protected and that the resources we had mobilized would remain invisible to the world, used only for the purposes they were intended: care, opportunity, and safety. I looked at my children again, their small heads bent over breakfast, and felt the profound simplicity of what truly mattered. Life, in all its complexity and pressure, ultimately comes down to presence, to showing up, to meeting the small needs of those you love with consistency, patience, and unwavering attention. Everything else, the titles, the wealth, the applause, was secondary. The lessons of the past weeks were clear to me now, distilled in the slow rhythm of this quiet morning. Wealth is a tool, not a measure of worth. Presence is a measure of strength, and patience is a measure of power. The world may mock simplicity, but simplicity carries clarity, focus, and purpose that grandeur often obscures. I spent the rest of the day doing ordinary things that now felt extraordinary. I walked my children to the park, their laughter ringing through the cold air, a sound that made the frostbite of winter irrelevant. We returned home and tidied the apartment together, sharing small moments of humor and cooperation that strengthened bonds far more enduring than any courtroom victory. During the afternoon, as I brewed another pot of coffee, I reflected on the years that had brought me here, the empire I had once commanded, the wealth I had relinquished, the quiet life I had chosen. All of it had prepared me for this moment. Not for spectacle, not for glory, not for recognition, but for the steady, enduring work of fatherhood. I realized that my life's philosophy, the one I had held quietly for so long, was vindicated. True power lies not in wealth or fame, but in the capacity to endure, to protect, and to provide with unwavering presence. I allowed myself a brief smile, not of triumph, but of contentment. The courtroom had revealed the truth, yes, but the true victory was not legal or financial. It was in the quiet reclamation of what mattered most: the trust, safety, and happiness of the children I loved. Evening fell, and the apartment took on a soft, golden glow as the heater warmed the space and the lights cast long shadows across the walls. I watched my children play quietly, assembling blocks, drawing pictures, and talking in low voices about stories and adventures. Their laughter and chatter were the soundtrack of a life rebuilt, a life reclaimed from fear and uncertainty. I realized with a deep sense of calm that the lessons I had learned were not abstract. They were lived, embodied, and demonstrated every day. Fatherhood is not measured in wealth, in social standing, or in recognition. It is measured in presence, in patience, in the quiet, daily commitment to the lives of those entrusted to your care. I made a mental note, as I often did, to savor these moments. The ordinary, unremarkable moments of life are often the most profound. The smell of coffee, the warmth of a child's hand in yours, the sound of laughter that carries through a small apartment. These are the things that define a life, not the applause of the world or the digits in a bank account. I took a slow walk through the apartment, checking that everything was in order. Toys returned to shelves, clothes folded neatly, dinner plans in place. The life we led was simple, yes, but it was deliberate, organized, and imbued with purpose. That I realized was the essence of stability, not grandeur, not wealth, not appearances, but intention, care, and constancy. As night fell, I sat with my children on the small couch, reading stories and listening to their questions about the world. They asked about the court, about the people who had said unkind things, and about the strange cars and planes that had appeared that day. I answered simply, honestly, and without dramatics. The world sometimes misunderstands what matters, I said quietly. Some people measure success in things you can see, but the things that matter most, love, care, presence, cannot be measured that way. What matters is that we show up for each other every day. They listened, wide-eyed and attentive, and I realized once again that this was my greatest legacy. Not money, not power, not the empire I had once built, but the steady, consistent presence of a father who showed up every day, no matter the difficulty, no matter the challenge, no matter the noise of the world. Later, as the children drifted into sleep, I lingered in the quiet apartment. The faint hum of the city outside was softened by the insulation of home. The small victories of the day, laughter, trust, stability, settled around me like a gentle weight, grounding me in the reality that the life I had chosen was not lesser, not inadequate, but profoundly rich in ways the world often fails to recognize. I thought of aging, of the years that had brought me from the boardrooms of global power to this modest apartment. I realized that true wisdom comes not from wealth or recognition, but from endurance, reflection, and the understanding that what matters most cannot be lost, cannot be stolen, and cannot be measured by anyone but yourself. I made a quiet promise to myself and to my children that no matter what the future held, no matter what challenges arose, I would continue to prioritize presence over prestige, love over appearances, and quiet strength over loud ambition. And in that quiet reflection, I felt a profound satisfaction that no courtroom victory, no asset, and no public recognition could ever replicate. The life I had chosen, with all its simplicity and intentionality, was sufficient. It was enough. It had always been enough. As I turned off the lights and settled into the quiet embrace of the night, I whispered softly to the darkness, a truth I had carried for years. Life is not measured in wealth or accolades. It is measured in presence, in care, in the steady, unwavering commitment to those who depend on you. And in that, I have always been and will always be rich beyond measure.